Imagine a writer just completely high on benzedrine, fueled by nothing but black coffee.
And just this existential despair, he tapes this whole manuscript scroll together.
And then sits at his typewriter for 3 weeks straight.
3 weeks. And he churns out this 125,000-word novel without stopping for paragraph breaks, page changes.
Or sleep, frankly.
Right, or sleep. And that novel, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, it didn't just, top the bestseller list when it finally came out in 1957.
No, it detonated the decade. It completely blew it up.
It became the unofficial Bible for youth rebellion, and it sparked a level of moral outrage across the U.S. that is, it's difficult for us to even fathom today.
We're talking about actual book burnings.
In Chicago church parking lots, yes.
Yeah.
Condemnation from the highest levels of the Catholic Church. And then the ultimate kind of bizarre sign of its perceived danger.
The author himself gets placed under active FBI surveillance.
For years.
And that's really our mission today. This book was this, accidental, electrifying act of cultural vandalism.
Right, against the manicured lawns and the rigid social rules of the conformist 1950s.
So we need to understand not just the plot, but the physics of how it was created, the philosophy behind it. Why was this story of just reckless escape such a profound threat to Eisenhower's America?
And maybe more importantly, why do its themes, this desperate search for genuine experience, for perpetual motion, for authenticity, why do they still feel so relevant?
They connect directly to things we see today, like the van life movement or the whole digital nomad culture.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The sheer energy the establishment wasted trying to suppress a story that, at its heart, is just a frantic, jazz-infused odyssey across post-war America.
Driven by this desperate, almost religious hunger for an authentic, unmediated experience.
A complete rejection of the prepackaged life path.
So just to set the stage for anyone who hasn't read it, the story is fundamentally simple.
Very simple at its core. It's about a small group of young men who look at the big prize of American life.
The suburban house, the steady corporate job, the nuclear family.
All of it. And they don't just reject it.
No, they're nauseated by it.
Exactly. So they choose instead this unpredictable, exhilarating, and let's be honest, often deeply destructive path of the open highway.
All driven by this belief that real life is found in movement.
Precisely. The core premise was simple, but for its time it was revolutionary. It follows the narrator, Sal Paradise.
Who is basically Kerouac, a thinly veiled stand-in.
Right. And Sal is searching for some kind of spiritual truth that he can't quite articulate, and his whole quest is driven by this profound, sometimes masochistic obsession with Dean Moriarty.
The magnetic, manic anti-hero.
Who is the physical embodiment of speed. He's this relentless, almost inhuman force who lives purely aggressively in the present moment.
And he just drags Sal and everyone else along on these desperate cross-country sprints that always seem to end in, exhaustion or failure.
Always. Dean isn't just a character. He's more like a philosophical problem for Sal.
A hurricane in human form. And to understand the novel, you absolutely have to start with the legend of how it was physically created. The story of the scroll is just pure literary mythology.
It's maybe the most famous origin story in modern literature. It has to be.
It was such an unprecedented physical act.
And it was born out of this desire for absolute, total immediacy. We really have to detail the creation process of this so-called dangerous scroll back in April of 1951.
Because Kerouac was obsessed with this idea of capturing pure, unfiltered consciousness.
Without any of the traditional intrusions like editing or structure or even just the mechanical pause of changing a piece of paper in the typewriter.
He genuinely believed that stopping to edit, or even just stopping to switch pages, broke the rhythmic flow of his thought.
It corrupted the spontaneity. That was the word he used.
So what does he do?
To get around this mechanical limitation, he devises this radical solution. He doesn't use standard typing paper. He gets hundreds of sheets of tracing paper or architect's paper.
Okay.
And he meticulously tapes them together end to end to create one continuous 120-foot surface.
Wow.
And then he feeds this massive roll through his typewriter.
Like a ridiculously long literary ticker tape machine. It's a physical metaphor for the style.
Absolutely. Continuous motion, no breaks. The goal was pure, unfiltered consciousness flowing directly onto the page. He typed nonstop for 3 weeks.
Sometimes for 20 hours straight.
Which meant no stopping for paragraph breaks, no chapter divisions, not even changing pages. He was creating the first literary equivalent of a full-speed, uninterrupted stream of thought.
what he called spontaneous prose,
Exactly.
which leads us directly to the fuel for this whole thing. And the extreme, I mean, nearly fatal cost of that 3-week burst.
Right.
This wasn't just a passionate artist working late into the night. This was an author pushing his mind and body past every conceivable human limit.
Powered by a really volatile cocktail of benzedrine tablets and black coffee. It was the only way he felt he could match the sheer speed and the breathless energy of the road he was trying to capture on the page.
And this is where the dark side of that spontaneity really comes out.
It's profoundly tragic. Benzedrine, which is an amphetamine, was actually legal and widely available at the time.
Right. Truckers used it. Students used it to stay awake.
But in these massive doses, combined with the sleep deprivation, it rapidly induced severe paranoia, intense anxiety attacks, deep psychosis.
So by the second week of this writing marathon, Kerouac was suffering violently.
He was having vivid hallucinations, seeing these shadowy government figures in his peripheral vision, completely convinced they were watching him.
He was hearing voices that weren't there, constantly checking the windows for spies.
And the horrible irony is that this was a premonition of the actual FBI surveillance that would come later. It's just astonishing.
The physical toll must have been immense.
He lost nearly 20 pounds in those 3 weeks. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely light a cigarette or hold his coffee cup.
In his speech, when he tried to talk to people, it became rapid, obsessive.
Incoherent. His mother, Gabrielle, who he lived with on and off his whole life, she later told friends she was genuinely afraid her son was having a complete mental breakdown and needed to be institutionalized.
So when he finally collapses from exhaustion, he has this thing, 125,000 words written as a single, sprawling, breathless, uninterrupted paragraph.
And the initial reception from the literary establishment was, as you can imagine, just hostility and confusion.
They rejected it for 6 long years. And you have to understand the specifics of that rejection to really get the conformity of the 1950s literary scene.
Publishers literally argued this isn't a novel, this is typing.
They weren't just criticizing the content, they were attacking the form itself.
Exactly. They complained it had no traditional structure, no chapters, no clear paragraph breaks, no organized plot. It made any kind of conventional editing impossible.
So they demanded he use aliases for all the real people, censor all the references to sex and drugs,
And impose a structure on it. So the scroll just sat there, gathering dust, until Viking Press finally took a huge risk on it in 1957.
But the genius of it, the real innovation, wasn't just the uninterrupted speed. It was the creation of a whole new literary language. This wasn't James Joyce's stream of consciousness, that introspective labyrinthine style. This was what he called spontaneous prose.
And it was a conscious, deliberate rejection of that careful, structured, modernist tradition. Kerouac's prose was designed to capture the energy and the improvisation of American art forms.
Specifically bebop jazz.
Yes, specifically bebop. He explicitly compared the flow of his prose to the long, rapid-fire saxophone solos of artists like Charlie Parker or Lester Young.
He wasn't just describing a jazz session, the writing was the session.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
The sentences don't follow traditional grammatical rules. They follow a rhythmic logic. They build momentum like a freight train, these long, expansive runs that can go on for pages.
Held together by what? Commas and dashes and the word and.
Pretty much. And that technique captured the rhythm of authentic, fast-paced American speech, slang, and this kind of desperate, reckless optimism that formal literature had just completely ignored before.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that spontaneous prose for a second.
Yeah.
What he was trying to do was bypass the critical self-editing part of your brain, right? The part that says, is this good? Is this structurally sound?
He wanted the prose to move at the speed of thought. And when you're on the road and on benzedrine, that speed is incredibly fast. He called his style sketching.
Sketching?
Yeah, he would take notes and write descriptions as rapidly as a painter might sketch a figure that's in motion.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the comma, for him, replaced the period because the thought was never really finished. The journey was never over. He believed the period was too conclusive, too static.
The source material is a perfect example of this. It shows how the prose doesn't just describe the experience of driving, it actually recreates the feeling of constant, exhilarating movement for you, the reader.
Right, when he's describing his devotion to Dean.
Yes, and it wasn't only because he was a sweet-gone character, but because he was a man and a brother, and his soul was in trouble, and his madness and his wildness were a part of the madness and wildness of the world, and they were beautiful and right.
See, That structure just runs on and on. It builds emotional intensity. It accumulates detail, clause after clause. It mirrors the relentless speed and the blurred scenery of driving 90 miles an hour across the desert.
So the synthesis here is crucial.
The prose doesn't just describe the experience of constant movement. By forcing you to absorb that velocity, it is the experience of movement. You feel that breathless energy and that desperate search for meaning embedded right there in the language itself.
It's kinetic writing. It's writing that moves. Okay, so that was the machine, the spontaneous prose in the scroll. Now, let's pivot to the man behind the machine, the author, Jack Kerouac.
Born Jean-Louis the Brit de Kerouac.
From a working-class French-Canadian family in Lowell, Massachusetts. And he was a man just defined by these intense, unresolvable contradictions.
And that internal conflict is the engine of the entire book. Kerouac was, at his core, an American Catholic mystic who was sort of disguised as a hedonist.
And the defining trauma of his childhood was the death of his older brother, Gerard.
His deeply religious older brother, Gerard, yeah. Jack was only 4 years old. Gerard died of rheumatic fever and was instantly mythologized by the family as this kind of saintly figure.
And that tragedy just shaped his entire life and philosophy.
Absolutely. It created this lifelong internal struggle. On one hand, Kerouac was constantly striving for the kind of spiritual purity and salvation he associated with his dead brother,
Haunted by this deep-seated Catholic guilt.
while at the same time he was rebelling violently against those confining expectations, trying to find transcendence through fast living and constant motion. He was running from the church, but he was always looking for God on the road.
Which explains so much. Beneath all the sex and the drugs and the jazz, you have these profoundly spiritual undertones, these references to Buddhism, this yearning for grace.
And he did try, early on, to conform to the American dream.
People forget that. Despite his later reputation as the king of the wild bohemians, he was a gifted student and athlete. He won a football scholarship to Columbia University.
He was a jock, a star running back. But he felt profoundly alienated from that privileged Eastern Ivy League world. He saw it as phony.
As just another version of the conformist expectations he was trying to run away from.
Exactly. After brief stints in the Navy and the Merchant Marine during World War II, he came back to New York determined to be a serious literary writer.
And that's when he finds his people, the nascent Beat generation.
Right, he's exposed to these intellectual anarchists like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, and they give him the experimental writing techniques, the idea of breaking form.
But the crucial catalyst was Neal Cassady.
That's the key. Burroughs and Ginsberg provided the framework for the literary rebellion, but Cassady showed Kerouac how to live the experience.
He was the raw material.
He was the explosive, relentless, raw material that spontaneous prose was designed to capture. The moment that intellectual influence met the visceral reality of Cassady's life, that fusion created on the road.
Which brings us to the legendary figure that defined the book, and really a generation. Dean Moriarty.
Who was barely disguised autobiography. It was just Neal Cassady on the page.
So Sal Paradise, Kerouac's character, is the introspective observer. Dean is the manic, charismatic anti-hero who is pure, untamed energy.
And Cassady was a genuine force of nature, a mythological figure in his own right. A working-class kid from the slums of Denver spent most of his youth in and out of reform school.
He was this explosive extrovert who lived entirely in the present moment.
Completely. He prioritized immediate, visceral experience over any kind of planning or consequence. He was, for Kerouac, the ideal. Someone totally unbound by the limitations of society.
The ultimate counterpoint to 1950s cautious stability.
He was pure, destructive, magnificent speed. It was like he decided to just delete his entire personal history and live purely in the second-to-second experience of the now.
And his real-life resume was even wilder than the book suggests.
Oh, much wilder. Which is what cemented his legendary status among the Beats. Let's just detail some of this.
Okay.
By the time he was 16, Cassady had already stolen, or been involved in stealing, over 300 cars.
300.
And he wasn't quiet about it. He famously claimed he could hotwire and start any vehicle in under 90 seconds. And these weren't just petty thefts, they were high-stakes, almost performative stunts.
Driven by a need for exhilaration.
The source material gives some incredible examples. He once stole a Cadillac from right outside a Denver police station just to prove he could do it.
And then what? He returns it.
Returns it later that night with a full tank of gas and an apology note tucked under the wiper blade.
That's unbelievable.
His driving stunts were legendary. He once drove 110 miles per hour through a treacherous Colorado blizzard while reading a philosophy book, smoking a joint, and carrying on 3 different conversations.
The man crashed 5 cars in 1948 alone.
And always walked away completely unscathed. His friends called him impossible to kill.
The most notorious stunt, though, the one that perfectly captures that beautiful anarchy Kerouac saw as spiritual,
Was stealing a car, driving it in record time from Denver to New York, and then abandoning it in Central Park.
with a bouquet of flowers and a love poem tucked under the windshield wipers. It's theft is performance art.
And that's the key. Kerouac didn't see him as a delinquent. He saw Cassidy as a force of nature, a spiritual guide.
He represented a total, uncompromising rejection of the conventional American life.
He chose perpetual motion. And crucially, he embraced what Kerouac called the holy goof.
We have to linger on that phrase, the holy goof. It's introduced so quickly, but it's the core of the whole philosophy. It's not just foolishness.
No, it's sacred foolishness. Within Kerouac's developing Buddhist beliefs, this was the idea that intentional folly acting outside the restrictive norms of society was a necessary path to spiritual truth.
So by acting recklessly or goofing off, you shed your ego.
And the suffocating structures of social expectations. It's the idea that true enlightenment or freedom requires you to be so unconstrained that society just views you as mad or foolish. And Dean Moriarty was the living proof that a person could exist purely outside of consequence, always seeking it.
It being that moment of total, untainted presence.
Yes.
So it's not just hedonism, it's a desperate search for transcendent grace through chaotic action. He's trying to shock himself and everyone around him into a moment of pure realization.
And that manic, chaotic philosophy collided head-on with the most orderly moment in modern American history.
When the book finally hits the shelves in 1957.
Right, and you have to contextualize this moment. It was the absolute zenith of Eisenhower's America.
The country was enjoying this massive post-war prosperity, but that prosperity came with a non-negotiable social contract. Conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory.
The culture was defined by these rigid social structures, the mass production of suburban houses, the uniform of the gray flannel suit for men.
And the unquestioned, often suffocating ideal of the nuclear family. Stability, order, and homogeneity were the highest virtues.
And into this perfectly manicured, tightly controlled landscape drops a novel.
Written in a chaotic style driven by chemical speed.
About stealing cars, having casual sex, doing drugs, and chasing improvised jazz across the country, rejecting all authority and tradition. The collision was inevitable, and it was violent.
The reaction was immediate and completely polarizing. It split right down the lines of the old guard versus the emerging youth culture.
On one hand, you had the intellectual elite. They recognized its groundbreaking literary merit. The New York Times critic Gilbert Milstein famously hailed it as a historic occasion, calling it the defining voice for a new, restless generation.
But the vast majority of critics and cultural authorities were horrified.
Absolutely horrified. The San Francisco Chronicle denounced it as a road to nowhere, accusing Kerouac of glorifying delinquency, immorality, and profoundly antisocial behavior.
So the moral panic among parents, religious leaders, educational authorities, it was intense and visceral.
The great fear was that their children would read it and immediately drop out of college to pursue the holy goof.
Which, as we know, started happening in droves.
Religious leaders responded with fire and brimstone. And you have to note the specific strong language they used. Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York, a hugely influential Catholic leader, publicly condemned the book as a handbook for moral degeneracy.
He urged Catholic bookstores not to sell it.
Exactly. And then Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, a massive figure in conservative Christianity, declared from his pulpit that the book was a poison that will corrupt the minds of our youth.
And this panic led to bizarre, tangible, real-world action. We're not talking about quiet censorship. We're talking public spectacle.
The details confirm there were actual book burnings organized by concerned mothers in Chicago church parking lots. They threw copies of On the Road into literal bonfires while singing hymns. The level of hysteria was shocking.
Yeah, and it reached government institutions and schools.
The American Legion condemned the entire Beat movement as un-American propaganda designed to undermine traditional family values. And on a local level, one school board in Texas actually hired private investigators,
Using taxpayer money.
using taxpayer money to infiltrate high schools and find students who owned copies of the book, threatening them with suspension if they were caught with it. The book literally became contraband.
And all of this chaos, it leads to the ultimate sign that you have written a truly dangerous, culturally subversive book.
FBI
The
surveillance.
Bureau saw the Beat movement not as literature or art, but as a clear and present threat to American values and national security. They were convinced all this talk of anarchy had to be masking a communist connection.
It just speaks volumes about the paranoia of the Cold War era. For J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, any deviation from strict middle-class conformity was immediately suspicious.
So the Bureau initiated active surveillance on Kerouac.
FBI agent John Francis was tasked with monitoring Kerouac's mail and phone calls for over 3 years.
The surveillance file grew to over 500 pages. That's an incredible amount of administrative dedication to tracking a guy who just wants to write about driving.
It's astounding. Those files meticulously documented his every public appearance, every contact, cataloged the names of anyone who attended beat poetry readings or jazz performances he went to. They needed to map the network of subversion.
So agents followed him into Greenwich Village coffee shops and jazz clubs, taking photos of him.
They actively infiltrated his social circle with undercover operatives. The lengths they went to were absurd.
And the memos detailed these ridiculous conclusions they were drawing.
One internal FBI memo suggested, with total seriousness, that On the Road might actually be written in code.
In code.
Yeah. The cross-country travels and the routes described in the book, they theorized, could actually be secretly describing communist escape routes for spies traveling across the continental United States. The paranoia was completely out of control.
Which brings us back to that profound, tragic irony we touched on earlier. Kerouac was suffering from drug-induced paranoia, convinced that government agents were watching him and tapping his phone.
Leading his own mother to worry about his sanity.
And his paranoia, which felt like a total mental breakdown.
It was rooted entirely in reality. His phone was tapped, he was being watched. The shadowy figures he saw were, in fact, the government, manifesting the very fears of institutional oppression that fueled the entire Beat movement.
The book was dangerous precisely because the government treated it as such.
Right.
So here's where it gets thematically interesting for us today. Why did this book endure past the 1950s? What are the core philosophical themes, and why do they resonate just as strongly now in our hyper-connected post-road world?
Well, the book is grappling with the fundamental philosophical dilemma of the individual versus society, and that's a struggle that never ends.
Kerouac is asking, what fundamental spiritual lasting meaning can you find outside of materialist success?
What happens when you strip away the expectations of your decade? Whether that's 1950s suburbia or, the hyper-curated performative perfection of the digital age, and you just try to find a raw, authentic human experience.
That search for authenticity is the central driver. Kerouac saw the trips not just as hedonistic joyrides, but as a spiritual quest.
Heavily influenced by his complex study of Buddhism and mystic Christianity, he was looking for satori, for enlightenment, in a materialistic society that he felt had completely lost its soul.
And this is exactly how we bridge the gap to the present day. That struggle is still acutely relevant because every generation faces a new form of prescribed conformity.
You see clear modern echoes in the van life movement. All these influencers and average people escaping the crushing weight of corporate jobs, trading their cubicles for converted Sprinter vans and mountain views.
They've effectively swapped Cassidy's stolen Cadillac and hitchhiking thumb for a leased vehicle with solar panels and reliable Wi-Fi. The medium changed, but the motivation is identical.
Precisely. Digital nomads working remotely from coffee shops in Bali or Lisbon are chasing the exact same freedom Kerouac described 70 years ago.
They have MacBooks instead of royal typewriters, but they're driven by the same hunger to evade the stasis of the 9-to-5 and experience life in continuous motion.
So the central message is unchanged. A real, meaningful life requires stepping outside your comfort zone, embracing risk, and constantly challenging the conventional definitions of success and happiness.
That restless American hunger for meaning just beyond the next horizon is what gives the book its permanent power.
It's the paradox of the road itself. The freedom is intoxicating, but the very act of constant motion means you're never truly rooted, never truly finished, and rarely comfortable.
And the immediate influence on the youth of the time was staggering. It was immediate. Within months of publication, it became the unofficial Bible of rebellion for college students.
The phenomenon was a cultural tsunami. College dropouts surged across the country. Columbia University reported a 23% increase in students leaving mid-semester, often leaving these vague notes about needing to find themselves.
Harvard's dean, McGeorge Bundy, was overwhelmed. He received dozens of letters from students announcing they were abandoning their studies to find themselves on the American highway.
But the reality of trying to live the holy goof was far less romantic than the prose suggested. And some of these adventures ended tragically, confirming the worst fears of the moral crusaders.
Tragically so.
3 Princeton students died in a horrific car crash in Nevada while trying to recreate Dean Moriarty's manic cross-country speed records.
And a Yale sophomore was found dead in a Denver flophouse from an overdose, with a well-worn copy of On the Road still in his jacket pocket.
It got so acute that the University of California at Berkeley started requiring students to sign waivers, acknowledging they'd read warnings about impulsive life decisions inspired by contemporary literature. The book was literally killing its readers.
And the author himself was just utterly unprepared for this sudden, chaotic fame after so many years of poverty and obscurity.
He wrote the book for his personal salvation, not as a manifesto for rebellion.
Kerouac was a deeply private, profoundly conflicted, and ultimately very fragile person. The constant attention, the misinterpretation, the responsibility of being crowned the king of the beats, it was excruciating for him.
He was a writer who wanted the world to read his words but not to look at him. And he rapidly began drinking heavily to cope with this unwanted, brutal celebrity.
His public appearances became legendary disasters.
They're heartbreaking to review. On The Steve Allen Show in 1959, he showed up visibly drunk, so anxious he could barely read his own work coherently on national television.
And later, on William F. Buckley's conservative program Firing Line, he got so intoxicated during the taping that he stopped engaging with Buckley and started aggressively arguing with the cameras instead.
At one point, he stood up and slurred a physical challenge to the studio audience.
He'd show up to college lectures so drunk that students would walk out in embarrassment. At one infamous Harvard speaking engagement, he actually passed out cold at the podium.
Had to be carried off stage by students.
And this tragic decline was fueled by a profound, agonizing contradiction. He had written about this ultimate search for spiritual freedom, influenced by his Catholic mysticism and Buddhism.
Yet the counterculture, the hippies of the 60s, they embraced the book purely as a justification for hedonism.
And that gap just destroyed him.
He grew increasingly conservative later in life, supporting the Vietnam War, aggressively criticizing the hippies who claimed him as their hero, feeling they completely misunderstood his spiritual quest as mere pleasure-seeking.
The tragedy is that the freedom he wrote about was spiritual, meant to liberate the soul. But his fame tied him permanently to the physical, self-destructive freedom of his anti-hero, Dean Moriarty.
The personal cost of this literary success was enormous. His alcoholism worsened drastically throughout the 1960s. He spent his final years isolated and bitter, retreating to live with his mother in Florida, thousands of miles from the open road he'd glorified.
He was fundamentally destroyed by the fame he never wanted and the responsibility of the movement he inadvertently started.
So we're left with this profound, painful paradox. The writer who, in 3 weeks, captured the feeling of complete freedom and endless possibility dies at the age of 5 or 7 from complications of alcoholism.
Isolated, bitter, and far from the road, the man who glorified perpetual motion found only stasis at the end.
And that is the central reflection of this deep dive. Here's the key takeaway for you, the listener. When reading On the Road or exploring its history, focus not just on the wild behavior,
The stolen cars, the jazz clubs, the manic energy.
but on the profound, long-term cost of that freedom. Kerouac wasn't writing a joyful manifesto. He was writing a desperate plea for salvation. The author paid the highest price to tell this story, and the freedom he glorified remained forever beyond his grasp, even as he gave it to millions.
And if we look critically at the mythology of Dean Moriarty, of Neal Cassady, we have to ask the moral question, right? How do we reconcile the beauty of the prose with the genuine recklessness and criminality of the subject?
That's the necessary pushback. We celebrate Cassady's anarchy, but reading his resume, stealing hundreds of cars, driving dangerously, he's also a criminal who put countless lives in danger.
Kerouac romanticized him as a hero because he represented an escape from Kerouac's own paralyzing Catholic guilt and intellectual restraint.
But for the average person, Cassady was simply chaos. And the book lives on precisely because it forces us to hold those two ideas in tension. The beauty of absolute freedom versus its often destructive, impractical reality.
It endures because it captures that essential American restlessness, that hunger for meaning and new experiences that resides in every generation, regardless of the consequences.
Right.
So, what does this all mean for us today, reading this story in the 21st century? What constraints in your own life, digital, corporate, social life, is Kerouac inspiring you to question? Is it the perfect, curated Instagram life, the steady corporate ladder, the belief that you have to conform to find success?
The book remains potent because it asks us to stop typing and start living, even if Kerouac himself failed to find happiness in that transition.
So today we've covered the legend of the dangerous scroll, the spiritual fuel of benzedrine and jazz, the violent collision of the holy goo philosophy with Eisenhower's conformity.
The bizarre reality of FBI surveillance and the tragic price Kerouac paid for giving the world its unofficial roadmap to rebellion.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most influential and transformative stories come not from the most polished writers.
But from those who paid the highest price to capture life in its rawest, most dangerous form.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex history and profound cost of On the Road.
We hope this gave you a new, more critical lens through which to view one of America's most influential and ultimately most tragic novels.